No year of reading ever turns out like you expected. At least for me it doesn't. Over time I'm gradually beginning to make peace with that fact. Every hairline fracture in a broken plan is a space for that aleatoric magic to rush in, to spill its ink blindly over your lists and charts until they flower into Rorschach formations. And hopefully, if you're lucky, you discern something beautiful and new. I thought I'd share some of the most beautiful things I found this year with you. As with previous end-of-year lists, I'm limiting myself exclusively to fiction here, and none of my rereading is included. So for a book to get on this list, it had to be something that I read for the first time in 2024. I've tried to limit myself to things that I'm excited enough by to want to reread at some point in the future. As always, I'd love to hear in the comments what your favourite reads of 2024 were. I love hearing your wonderful recommendations. I always make so many great discoveries through all of you, so please feel free to do that. Sometimes things go missing when you're not paying attention. Their presence is so stable that you expect them always to be there. Such was the case for me with John Burnside, whose exceptionally prolific stream of publications, interviews and appearances had come with such regularity ever since I first became aware of him. Somehow I didn't learn of his passing until November of this year, though he died, sadly, at the end of May. I've long admired John Burnside as a poet, and I know him primarily as a poet. There are quite a few collections that I go back to again and again. And I also really enjoyed his memoir, which I read last year, A Lie About My Father. But I hadn't had any experience with him as a novelist up until now. So when I heard of his passing, I thought it would be a great time to pick up this book, Glister, which I'd had my eye on for a really long time. The novel takes place in the fictional Inner Town, a bleak industrial place on whose outskirts lies a decommissioned chemical plant. No one seems to know what was once produced there, but its effects on the inhabitants of Inner Town are palpable. The earth is contaminated. The nearby forest is nicknamed the Poisonwood. Rates of cancer and other diseases have soared. Meanwhile, boys have started to disappear without warning. The young people left behind survive by finding their thrills where they can, in sex, drugs, drink, and violence. Having read John Burnside's memoir really enriched my experience of Glister, in that a lot of it seems like a reflection of his own background and circumstances. The character of Leonard seems much like a stand-in for John Burnside himself, and Inner Town seems to mirror to Cowden Beath, where he spent much of his miserable childhood. The Inner Town chemical plant, too, seems modelled on the Moss Moran petrochemical plant, which has faced legal action over environmental violations. Employees have walked out on several occasions over safety concerns, most recently as late as August of last year. In an interview on the occasion of the German publication of Glister, Burnside drew attention to some of these parallels.
Leonard he's like, I was like him when I was his age. I lived in an industrial town. It was a horrible place to live. It was dirty, it was poisoned. Recently there was a big court case about the poisoning in the ground. And like Leonard, I put my life together from the library, from looking at old films, and a kind of interior fantasy life, and constantly trying to make up new stories and trying to survive morally and imaginatively in a place which was completely grey. The overwhelming impression of it is greyness.
In the same interview, Burnside will go on to say that Leonard, unlike many of the other characters, is alive, and it's his ability to apprehend beauty even at the heart of ugliness that saves him from the horror that threatens to engulf everyone around him. For him, even the old chemical plant can be a source of beauty, even an art object.
The chemical plant is always beautiful, even when it's frightening. A giant chimney rises up into the clouds. A wide brick chimney that, in the wet months, fills with great cascading falls of rain, just as the glass roofs and the sheets of corrugated metal on the storerooms will break into a music that sounds repetitious when you first hear it, but soon begins to reveal itself as an infinitely complex fabric of faint overtones and distant harmonics that is never quite the same from one moment to the next. Maybe they should send a musician out here, turn it into music. That would be something.
One of the strangest and most compelling things about the book is its structure, and if you were only to read the first chapter, you'd be forgiven for thinking that you're about to read a sort of police procedural novel, but quite quickly its concerns begin to warp and shift. The thread of its plot is subsumed into poisoned ground. The book is a misshapen thing, a diseased, mutilated crime narrative that descends low enough to encompass acts of vicious brutality and ascends high enough to touch clouds of mysticism and absorb moments of psychedelic reverie. When you encounter certain writers, you know that over time you'll read everything they've written. This becomes a simple fact written into your own biography. It's just a matter of time. After reading and absolutely adoring Lolly Willows last year, I knew that I wanted to explore Sylvia Townsend Warner's work much more, and I confess that the corner that held them in some ways really exceeds Lolly Willows in terms of scope and beauty. It's published quite a bit later in 1948. There's a feeling of richness when reading Warner. Rich detail, rich interior lives, rich imagination and expression. The heft of each sentence so elegantly balanced, possessed of its own interior architecture and its right load-bearing place in the whole, which hangs together like a perfect masonry arch. Warner takes as her subject a convent in the village of Oby in Norfolk and the lives of its nuns under many different prioresses. The core of the book spans the second half of the 14th century, roughly from the outbreak of the Black Plague to the Peasants' Revolt. I can imagine that such a subject might seem at first obscure, and indeed the remoteness of this life from the life of the world is one of the book's concerns. But one of the enormous pleasures of the book is to open its pages in the midst of a crowded train on your way to the job you hate, and be invited into this secluded space, this edgeland of recorded time, to move at the unhurried pace that it commands, while the sprawl of a city speeds past your window unregarded. Time travel, yes, but perhaps a kind of disappearance too, a literary vanishing act. Yet for all its seclusion and serenity, what strikes one most forcefully when reading the book is the fact that its characters' concerns are not, for the most part, tied to a contemplation of spiritual matters, of the soul or worship. The life at the convent in Oby is decidedly earthly. Its characters are occupied by legal disputes, the channeling of funds from wealthy patrons towards the convent, the stocking of the larder, what will be cooked for breakfast tomorrow, the tending of livestock, which silverware to lay out during the bishop's visit, labour disputes with the masons hired to erect a new spire, etc., etc. These material matters, this worldly weight, secures the book's cast fiercely to the ground, an overabundance of ballast that ensures no one sails too high on the wings of dreams, just as you, in the modern world, carry out the daily labour that precludes dreaming at all. And yet many of the book's characters are dreamers. In some ways, the book seems to be largely about unrealised dreams, and much of its pathos stems from the inability of its characters to act. The charlatan priest Sir Ralph, for instance, often seems so close to quitting the nunnery, striking out across the country, of acting a parallel to the heroism he reads of in an English poem, The Lay of Mamillion, with which he becomes obsessed. And yet, for all his desire for adventure, the lethargy and weight of life at Obi proves too much for such dreams.
And his thoughts trudged in a round of speculation as to how he should live next. Whether he should go to a town and hope to pick up a livelihood as a copyist, or follow the plough, or load a pack with bones and beads and set up as a relic peddler, or go to sea, or become a soldier. He must do one or the other. One day or another he must set about it. Meanwhile, he was still bewintered at Obi and thinking, tomorrow is Saturday, so we shall have beans and bacon. I hope there will be more bacon in my portion this Saturday.
Sir Ralph's fate is mirrored in so many of the book's episodes, notably the erection of the spire, which takes so long to build and which tumbles down not long after, echoes symbolically this malaise of inactivity. I must admit that reading about this convent weathering the Black Plague allowed certain vestigial psychological after effects of living through the pandemic to rise up. This fear of strangers, this need to keep one's guard up, really kind of struck home once again on reading this book. There are still parts of the world, though it's difficult to believe, in which people live untouched, uninfected by our infected world. Communities living in voluntary isolation, the so-called uncontacted tribes. Occasionally, when this isolation is broken without consent, the consequences can be disastrous. In 2018, for instance, the 26-year-old John Chow attempted to make contact with the Sentinelese people on the remote North Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean. Chow was attempting to live among the community, to introduce Christianity. He failed to heed the hostile warnings he was offered and was ultimately killed. A similar situation, though geographically removed, forms the backdrop of the next book I want to discuss. And though at times it reads like a fantasy, Chow's story is a reminder that such things still happen in the 21st century. The region of West Papua in Western New Guinea is home to at least 40 such uncontacted tribes, and this is the setting that forms the backdrop of Brendan Connell's excellent novel Cannibals of West Papua. The book itself is actually kind of a sequel to another book called The Translation of Father Torturo, but it's not entirely necessary to have read that book. This stands quite well on its own, although it might add another layer of depth. The setup feels akin to what one might find in an Italian exploitation horror film. I sensed, for instance, echoes of Cannibal Holocaust. A Catholic priest, Dom Ramiro, is flown in via helicopter to visit a remote tribe where Father Massimo, formerly Torturo, has been settled for some time. Ramiro, who is led by a bull-headed, uncompromising vision of the supremacy of Catholicism, insists, despite severe warnings, on penetrating deeper into the jungle, paying visits to uncontacted tribes with reputations for violence and cannibalism. When their helicopter crashes deep into this hostile territory where the bulwarks of so-called civilization were never erected, the priests must fend for themselves. Though the premise might sound somewhat sensationalist, in Brendan Connell's hands, sensationalism, an unabashed sense of fun, and even a certain reveling in the splatter of blood and gore is always balanced by a certain sensitivity. Connell can write scenes of frenzied, blood-soaked savagery, but is equally at home in a reflective mode, and his prose always feels wonderfully controlled. For instance, in a moment shortly after the helicopter crash when Dom Ramiro's ultimate descent into bloodlust is foreshadowed, he longs to return to Portugal to live out his days in civilization and comfort. he gathered up the bottle of arrack in his hands, screwed off the cap and lifted it high, drank until his throat and stomach were burning, and soon after closed his eyes, let his consciousness tumble through the forest of the night, pursued, it would seem, by some carnivorous impulse, some primeval compulsion which the sawing sounds of crickets and the thrusting prick of stars drew forth, a nostalgic urge of immobile dreams that, peeled back, revealed the gleam of crimson flowers. Incidentally, the allusion to William Blake's The Tiger strikes me as not at all out of place here. Ramiro's ark is in some sense a failed theodicy, a failure to accept that creation itself may emerge in a violent struggle, giving birth to predation along with benevolence. But the nature of this predation may not, from Connell's perspective, be the same as that Ramiro apprehends. The book is far more expansive than it at first appears. It spans the horrific and sensational, is threaded with the fantastical, but also encompasses anthropological and political concerns. This last is particularly apparent in the book's final moments, but also in its short preface, which Connell dedicates to the members of the International Council of Mining and Metals, to corporate chairmen and seekers and holders of public office, to the ministers of mining and energy, to the army generals who become presidents, to the principal shareholders and those who process the Earth's mineral resources in order to maximize gain for their shareholders. Yes, to you I dedicate these pages of blood and violence. May they stir in others the disgust you stir in me. This is a book that is profoundly conscious of where the real inhumanity lies. The next book is easily the most famous of those I'm including on this list. I can't quite say what took me so long to get to it. Sometimes you think you know what to expect of a book. So often you're wrong. The book I'm talking about is Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories from 1979. It's famously a series of retellings of European folk tales, and I think the fact that its reputation precedes it was what led to me feeling like I knew what to expect. What I didn't expect was the sheer drowning intoxication of Carter's language. There's an almost decadent ornamentalism to the style in many of these stories that basks in that transformative power of language. Language as white-hot blown glass. Language as kaleidoscope. Language like the intricate clockwork nested within finely crafted automata. Constructing vivid linguistic worlds seems to be a major concern of Carter's. In the introduction to my edition, Helen Simpson quotes from a letter by Carter written to Robert Coover, in which she writes, "I really do believe that a fiction absolutely self-conscious of itself as a different form of human experience than reality, that is, not a logbook of events, can help to transform reality itself." There are reasons to see fairy tales as emblematic of this quality, standing as they do in a sort of parallel relationship to reality, but containing a kind of fictive reality of their own. The messages and meanings of the fairy tale rarely deal in specifics, in concrete details. They traffic instead in metaphor, symbol, in archetypes, in primitive emotions. Carter takes full advantage of these qualities to construct crystalline allegories, snow globe scenarios that expose the violence, prurience, lust and covetousness of humankind, seeing perhaps in the tradition of the European folk tale a distillation of these atavistic drives. In a 1985 interview with John Haffenden, Carter speaks of taking the latent image, of taking the latent content of those traditional stories and using that, and the latent content is violently sexual. And because I'm a woman, I read it that way. The title story, a retelling of the French folktale Bluebeard, is one in whose source material the violently sexual content is hardly latent at all. Its bloodstains rise quite readily to the surface. But foregrounding this latent content is not all Carter does. The title story is also a good example of what Carter brings to the traditional material. The roots and the emotional truth of the narrative survive, but Carter is also interested in the blossoms, that is, the colour that renders the tale an aesthetic object. To its existing architecture she adds a voice. Our protagonist narrator is clever, a sharp observer of detail. She is not a blank innocent, but has personality, is sometimes cynical, confrontational. She expresses desire, engages in sexual power play with her new husband. Carter also throws the materiality of her fairy tale worlds into sharp relief. The blood-red luminescence of dresses and jewels gleam against the murky Gothic extravagance of the castle, assaulted on all sides by the waves. Carter luxuriates in these elusive linguistic labyrinths. The bloody chamber seems to surge out of a seabed of textual reference beyond the source tale. Shadows of Poe, the Marquis de Sade, Browning. But sometimes the stories engage in linguistic play for its own sake. Carter's Puss in Boots has one of the most entertaining narrators I've ever encountered, bulging with bravura, an exercise in feline verbal acrobatics. Sometimes she delights in the swell of strings, the decrepit castle, the heavy air and luscious drapery of the purest Gothic, as in one of my favourite of the tales, The Lady of the House of Love. This, for me, is when I love her the most, when she unleashes the most intoxicatingly rich scents and flavours. This sensual quality to her language is where the latent content of which she spoke finds novel expression. It is no longer coded through archetypes alone, but is the very material out of which the tales are woven. Envisioning history is always an act of imagination. Some know better than others how to nourish and cultivate history's soil, know how to charm the life within it so that it sprouts anew and stretches towards the sun. Daniel Mills is such a writer. Ever since I read his masterful novel Revenants, I've tried to keep up with whatever he puts out. His latest publication, this extraordinary novella, A Song in the Night, takes as its backbone the well-documented story of the composition of a famous hymn, It Is Well With My Soul, which was composed by the American lawyer and Presbyterian church elder Horatio Spafford. The story of the hymn is a particularly tragic one. After enduring the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871, which left the city, along with much of Horatio's property, in ashes, the Spaffords attempted a family trip to Europe. His wife Anne and their 4 children boarded the Ville du Havre, which sailed from New York, headed to the north of France. Unfortunately, Horatio was kept behind by his business and planned to join his family later. Disaster struck, however, when in the middle of the Atlantic, the Ville du Havre collided with another ship, an iron clipper, the Loch Earn. It took her 12 minutes to sink, taking down with her all 4 of Spafford's children. The eldest, Annie, was 12 years old. The youngest, Tanita, was barely 18 months. His wife alone survives. The words of Spafford's hymn carry echoes of the disaster. Mills's novella takes place for the most part in the shadow of this oppressive grief, and its evocation of the brutal impact of such a loss is quite sensitive and subtle. Its prose hums with a kind of twilit sonority. Its fractured linearity embodies structurally Spafford's racked psyche, which, as he navigates the streets of Paris, where he has come to join his wife, perceives the unfamiliar urban space as a haunted landscape. Images born of his sudden loss, of his desperation for renewed belief, pierce and shatter his hold on reality. Ruins rise from ashes. The Palais de Tuileries, burned in 1871 by the Paris Commune, becomes whole again in his visions. A queer light flickers across the garden, bright as flash powder. The earth rocks on its axis, and the palace is no longer a ruin, but restored to itself, suffused with a pale fire that streams from its doors and windows to light the winter garden into flower. Spafford glimpses crocuses, irises, trees in bloom, and a fragment of birdsong drifts down from above where the great dome hovers, weightless on its columns, as he too is floating, suspended in mid-air. Mills's portrait of a mind or temperament distorted by grief, clambering to rebuild itself, is deeply affecting. Along with the symbolism of the restoration of this temple, as it were, one finds threaded through the novella mystic intimations of Spafford's future, reverse echoes of the Christian utopianism that would eventually lead to his founding of the American colony in Jerusalem. The Occitan street preacher whom Spafford encounters and who spouts biblical arcanum, in which the book of Daniel features prominently, holds up a cosmic mirror to a private apocalypse. For Spafford, perhaps the end is in some sense the beginning. I was utterly enraptured by this short work, whose brevity really belies its capaciousness. Daniel Mills is a writer whose work is often rooted in research, but he really knows how to make those roots sprout and flower in the telling. I really encourage anyone to give his work a go, and this is a great place to start. Some books seem to come out of nowhere. Occasionally these days they are sent to me, driven by that desire I have from time to time to thrust a book into the hands of a passer-by, in the hope that they will feel what I felt, dream what I dreamt. Such a book was thrust into my hands this year by the very kind Megan Lamb, who gave me An Archaeology of Holes by Stacey Hardy. This is a South African writer about whom I knew absolutely nothing. I'd never even heard her name mentioned, but it so happened that it's one of the most powerful reading experiences of this year for me. Upon reading the first story, The Pattern of Trees, which is narrated by the dumped corpse of a murdered forensic pathologist, I was immediately aware that I was reading something special. The narrator traces in, well, there's no other word for it, forensic detail the decay of her own body, senses the fluttering whir of necrophagous insects, waits as the organs of sense themselves are devoured. Her ears are blocked up, filled with maggots. Her speech-producing anatomy is eaten. From the holes of her sockets she imagines flesh seething with blowfly larvae, full-grown beetles ripe with eggs feeding. She sees hordes of voracious ants and butterflies and carnivorous birds swooping down on her. Amid fractured flashbacks of her own murder, the knowledge of the steadily decreasing likelihood of her body being discovered rises and rises. It's an astonishing opening story, and one of the most arresting I've read in a while. Although Stacey Hardy doesn't shy away from horrific or visceral depictions of the body, the book is by no means a gore fest or even a horror book. Its stories are tremendously varied. Some are explicitly political, some are tender, but there are things that bind all of the stories together. So many pieces in the collection have a novel conceit at their center, sometimes explicitly fantastical, often surreal, often metaphorical. For instance, one of my favorite stories, The Taste of Your Tongue, examines the intersection of language, politics and sex by imagining a black market tongue transplant in which a parasitic louse inhabits the host's mouth, after which one relearns to speak, a potent metaphor in the notoriously polyglot South Africa. The stories are also bound together by a white-hot staccato style that manages the extraordinary feat of being both terse and rich. Every meticulously placed image is explosive, maximally impactful. The book is also held together by the motif of holes. Holes dug in the ground, every conceivable bodily orifice, the carving of fistulous passageways that link the land, the body, politics, and relationships. Stacey Hardy was a guest on Joe Bieletsky's fantastic podcast, Writing the Rapids, which incidentally I heartily recommend, and I'll leave a link in the description. And he asked her a question about this conceptual underpinning of the book, this motif of holes, and she spoke of a number of entry points to the collection.
When I first started writing, the first journal that ever published me was a South African journal that was called Donga. It's a name for a hole, a natural kind of hole in the environment, it's a natural kind of caving in that happens in the earth. And the literary journal described it as dongas are dangerous. You can fall into them. They're places where waste collect. And the last line was that they're a threat to the stable nation state. The stable floor falls out, and this allows for other kinds of accumulation. Those things that you don't want is often what goes into holes. We dig holes to bury what's unwanted, what falls out of society. And I think especially within my context of growing up in an apartheid South Africa, which I rebelled against quite strongly, the literary scene in South Africa was always something of a hole. When I think through where did this obsession with holes start to come in, I contracted tuberculosis and it went undiagnosed for 8 years. Within the contemporary situation, ironically, because it was always the disease of artists in, kind of 18th century and 19th century Europe, it's now globally kind of seen as a third world, a black disease. And as a white woman, I was not seen as an obvious candidate. Now, TB, it's a disease that eats holes in your organs. So I went into doing a lot of research into tuberculosis, and I can only describe it as literally, I went down the holes that the disease had eaten in my bodies, and I crawled down those holes. And when I came out, I found myself at the bottom of a mine shaft. The holes in my body led directly into the holes of the mining industry in South Africa, which is how tuberculosis was mainly spread, and one of the main reasons tuberculosis is endemic in South Africa. And then I started to really realize this linking between the holes in the body and the holes in the earth, and my own culpability as a white South African looking at my ancestry, the mining industry, extraction economies.
I really found An Archaeology of Holes to be an outlandishly good book, and to me it's a bit of a travesty that it currently stands at 5 ratings on Goodreads. I think far more people need to know about this one, and so I hope on watching this that lots more people will pick it up. It has so many truly memorable stories that are going to stick with me for a really long time. Among my favourites were Commingling, The Cow, A Butcher Fantasy, and The Wound. And I just want to thank Megan Lamb once again for putting this one in my hands. A book can be an invitation to another consciousness. To read can be to invite difference into one's life. In the most potent instances of this quality, one is left with an expanded colour palette through which to perceive the world. For me, this book was one of those cases. I'm talking about In Youth is Pleasure by Denton Welch, who's a writer I've been meaning to read for about 20 years, and I'm so glad I did, even if it took me all this time. The reason I'm talking about this book in terms of inviting difference is largely because of its protagonist. Young Orville seemingly cannot find his place anywhere. He's equally out of place around the laddish disorder and revelry of his boarding school as he is among his immediate family, his intimidatingly masculine brothers, and his aloof, depressive and inattentive father, who has returned from the Far East over the course of the summer to spend it with Orville in a Surrey hotel, and is still, we learn, grieving the loss of Orville's mother, whose name may not be mentioned. The length of the summer itself forms the framework or extent of the plot in this book, if we can really call it plot. There are events and small adventures and encounters with interesting characters and so on, but plot seems not to be exactly foremost among Denton Welch's concerns. What seems to be important to him is Orville's inner life, his idiosyncrasies, his solitary delights, the private aesthetics that drive him impulsively towards objects and people with a sense of profound connection, or in flight from them into unbridgeable separateness. In Youth is Pleasure is written in a very close third person, which privileges us with access to Orville's innermost delights and aversions. His attachment to and devotion to beauty is manifested in his attention to the materiality of things, an attention which sets him apart from others. He delights in architecture, clothing, objects of exquisite design. In one scene, after being upset by his older brother, Orville runs off into town, ducking into an antique shop, drowning his sorrows in an abundance of ornamental artifacts, scent bottles with silver knobs, china plates adorned with flower patterning, a gruesome armadillo skin work bag with a cherry satin lining, which makes him feel sick. Among these crafted material things, and particularly in extremes of pleasure and disgust, Orville finds a comfort he cannot find in everyday company. These sensations aren't limited to the inert, designed world. Orville seeks out the organic too, and the natural world, the soil and plants and the river around the hotel's grounds, become Orville's playground, as does his own body. Some of the book's most memorable and moving moments involve Orville alone exploring the surrounding countryside, dwelling on the minutest of sensations, observing the trees making a thick green shade, the khaki water in which swim darting insects as the sun filters through in round spots that tremble like jellyfish. Sexuality hums through the book too, part of the very cellular structure of Orville's aesthetic Epicureanism, expressing itself in homosexual and heterosexual urges towards the older man whom Orville meets in the woods and with whom he plays a game of tying up, which skirts the borders of sadomasochistic sex play, and towards Afra, a friend of his older brother's who radiates sexuality and who lavishes attention upon Orville, understands his difference. The searing pain of her betrayal when Orville spies her making love with his brother in an old ruin is an early lesson in adult emotions. And this is what makes In Youth is Pleasure such an extraordinary book. Its prose seems to embody Orville's hypersensitivity, and it draws the reader into the extremes of his aesthetic pleasure and disgust. We seem to inhabit Orville's consciousness and are reminded that those who are capable of the greatest sensitivity perhaps feel the burden of the world most acutely. I savoured every page of this book, and I hope others will choose to experience its overabundance of life. "2024 has been a big year for Quentin S. Crisp. He is the subject of Matthew Burker's excellent film Duckweed, which premiered in September of this year. Burker's sensitive soundtrack and lingering, seductive shots capture perfectly the experience of reading Crisp's work. His patience, his meditative attentiveness to the overlooked objects of this world, as well as an equal appetite for beauty and the surreal. If this remarkable film were not enough, 2024 also saw the printing of I Reign in Hell. This is from Centipede Press. It's a retrospective of Quentin S. Crisp's career in short stories and novellas. Anyone who's been watching the channel for some time will know how much of a fan I am of Quentin S. Crisp's work, and so I was utterly thrilled to finally have this one in my hands. I'd say about half of it is made up of stories that I've read before, but quite a few were entirely new to me, and some indeed are new to this publication. Returning to some old favourites was almost as exciting as reading some of the new stories. I delighted in returning to the sensuous ecstasies and bleak humiliation of The Mermaid, which is the very first story I ever read by him. The fantasy element is itself the narrator's elusive object, the dream of what it would be to encounter, to love, to possess a mermaid. Crisp's imaginative flair brings that fantasy tantalizingly close to his readers. The material and the fantastical meet in a lover's embrace, in that aching surrender of requital, whose very preciousness is the kernel of its catastrophe. For anyone who hasn't encountered Quentin S. Crisp's work before, I can think of no more satisfying place to begin than The Mermaid. But in terms of stories that I was familiar with, I was utterly disarmed this time by reading Italianetto. It's a story that I first read in Justin Isis's Japanese remix in the anthology Dadaoism. The story, better than any other I know, offers an account of the depth and solemnity of romantic feeling of which a child is capable, especially for an unattainable object. In some senses, it's a variation on the mermaid's theme, the longing for something or someone who, in some essential, almost ontological sense, remains beyond one's grasp. In Italianetto, the object of the young narrator's desire is the American starlet, Annette Funicello. She is made doubly unattainable by her stardom and her adulthood, but as she visits the boy's family, being in a relationship with his uncle, she is, once again, tantalizingly close. There's one scene that illustrates this aching distance and its attendant tragedy most beautifully. The boy observes Annette sunbathing. He raises his hand so that its shadow plays upon her back. Caught in this act, and chidingly questioned by his uncle, he retreats into boyhood, pretending to be making silly gestures with his hand in an invented game. In terms of the material with which I was unfamiliar, there were quite a few stories that I found truly arresting. For instance, an early story entitled The Psychopomps really had an effect on me, and I was really impressed by the degree to which its scale kind of opens out into an unexpected cosmic grandeur, and in which Quentin S. Crisp's relationship with Japanese culture first makes itself known in the form of the faceless ghost of Japanese folklore, the Nopperabo. Of the two previously unpublished pieces, Fractalism is, in my opinion, by far the greater achievement. It's a story that brings together so many strands: a very queasy body horror, environmental concerns, a profound anxiety about the future of humanity, the rate at which our productive detritus replicates, the trail of synthetic scurf we scatter across the planet. It also contains one of the finest and most unsettling dream sequences, always a high-risk choice in literature, that I've ever read. Overall, I enjoyed my time with I Reign in Hell. immensely towards the end of this year. And although it's not the selection I would have made in order to represent his career, and why would it be? I'm not the anthologist in this case. I think it does do a fantastic job of illustrating Quentin S. Crisp's range, the wonderfully Baroque Gothicism of his early stories, and the increasingly reflective qualities and formal openness of the later work. Underpinning it all are certain stable elements. There is the temperament of the artist and outsider, the one upon whose particular virtues and skills the world refuses to bestow value. There is that elegance of style so capable of sonority and philosophical depth. And there is that unhurried but concentrated attention towards those portions or states of the mind and the world that go so easily unheeded, perhaps even unrecorded, in lives governed by the speed of the digital age. The book in my number 2 spot is one that, during the compilation of this list, stood at number 1 for quite a long time, and I say this just to show how much I esteem it, so it was quite a close call. I'm talking about Nicholas Mosley's Hopeful Monsters, and this is a book that I've tried to read quite a number of times, and though I've always been enjoying it immensely, it somehow defeated me a few times, but I finally managed to read it all the way through this year, and I was just utterly enraptured all the way through. And strangely, it's one that seems not to be discussed all that much, despite being really widely acclaimed upon its publication in 1990. The book is, in some senses, an intellectual history of the interwar period in Europe, told via a correspondence between two characters, Eleanor, a German Jew in Berlin, the daughter of a physicist father and revolutionary mother, and Max, a young English boy growing up in Cambridge, son to a distant biologist father and an alcoholic psychiatrist mother. From these relatively peripheral perspectives, we witness some of the most crucial moments of the 20th century: the death of Rosa Luxemburg, Hitler's rise to power, the burning of the Reichstag, the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, the March of the Black Shirts, in which Nicholas Mosley's father played a central role, the construction of the atomic bomb. Its pages are also peopled by pivotal figures in the intellectual developments of the period: Einstein, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, as well as some disgraced outliers whose so-called discoveries were discredited: Paul Kammerer, Trofim Lysenko, whose presence seems to foreground some of the book's thematic concerns with the inheritance of acquired characteristics. While the book is quite emphatically a novel of ideas, it's no straightforward historical panorama, and what gives the book much of its character is the strangeness of its narration. Its two narrators, who over time come to seem two fragments of the same soul, speak with a detached, somewhat unemotional quality, as though they were alien observers of history, unearthly beings set adrift on its flood. Both are intellectually curious, but profoundly introspective, both trying to discover their place in the world, catholic in their sexual tastes, both involved in borderline incestuous relationships with a parent, in one case explicitly so, both given to the construction of surreal similes that strike like non sequiturs throughout the narrative, adding to its unreality. Eleanor observes orange-faced men in the Adlon Hotel who are like drops of oil or ointment on the point of touching a surface and spreading. Max in Spain notes that someone has a face like a bite bitten out of an apple. The book's style is so unlike anything else that I've encountered that I genuinely struggle when trying to describe it. It's just such an idiosyncratic approach to its subject matter. Interior monologue is lineated like dialogue. There are passages of relentless, almost stream of consciousness style. There are impassive, almost stilted passages, that record events without embellishment. There are periods of philosophical grappling with relativity. There are factual passages that outline scientific theories. There are mystical reveries, scenes of drunken, chaotic nights in Berlin. And yet the voice never falters. Its detached treatment of history as collective dream is one of uninterrupted brilliance. At the book's core, however, is the question of how to live as a human. The lessons of the period seem to be that humankind is driven to its own extinction. Max finds himself positing this very question. What if it is increasingly obvious that the human race does not want to survive? A metaphor for this human fragility seems to be embodied in the pet salamanders that Max keeps in an early chapter.
I bicycled into Miss Box to pick up my salamanders. They were two small bright lizards about 6 inches long. Their skin was mainly black but had gold patches and hoops. And then, when they were in the bright fair world that I had constructed for them, they were, yes, like jewels. They were so beautiful. They would be, yes, on the silver sand by the stones like gold or diamonds, like things made immortal by a painting. My mother came up to look at my aquaterrarium. She said, "That's beautiful." I said, "Yes." "What are they called?" "Adam and Eve." "What good names." I said, "I think they might also be what are called hopeful monsters." She said, "What are hopeful monsters?" I said, "They are things born perhaps slightly before their time, when it's not known if the environment is quite ready for them." She said, "So you have made an environment that might be ready for them?" I said, "Yes." She put her arms round me and hugged me. She said, "You are my hopeful monster."
The beautiful constructed world of the aquaterrarium becomes more than a recasting of the Garden of Eden. Later, Max, in the midst of fighting in the Spanish Civil War, will undergo a kind of epiphany, noting that humankind and the universe are a mutually creating organism, highlighting the potency of the image of the hand that draws a hand that is drawing itself. The potency, that is, of the receiving subject to shape the world by which it is shaped. A brief glimmer of creation as antidote to the destructive flow of history. This is a truly gargantuan work, and I'm very conscious of only having given it the most cursory of introductions here, but perhaps it's a mark of some of the greatest books that they possess a certain quality that renders them largely incommunicable without direct experience of them. Some ineffable quality that defies summary. Hopeful Monsters is also one of those books whose mystery is one of its most compelling qualities. I put it down with that feeling of waking up, its dream still lingering with me. I thought it'd be worth including a few honourable mentions that might very well have made it to my list under other circumstances. There are two huge books that I'd been meaning to read for a long time that I finally managed to get to this year. The first was Infinite Jest, and the second was the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And if I believed in any way that anyone needed to hear me talk about those books, I might have included them on this list, but I sincerely don't think that's the case. I also wanted to mention The Great Fire of London by Jacques Roubaud, who sadly passed away towards the end of this year. I recorded a whole video about that book, so if you want to hear me talk about that, you can find it elsewhere on my channel. But it was really one of the extraordinary reading experiences of this year. Some books come along just at the right time, at the peak of one's hyper-specific desire for that which only a single book can supply. I've been aware of M. John Harrison for a really long time. So many people whose tastes I really trust have recommended him to me, and I've owned books of his since I was in my late teens, but it took me all this time to finally get to reading him. And I'm so glad that I began my journey with Harrison with Viraconium, or the Viraconium cycle. It was one of those books this year that, as soon as I picked it up, became the only thing I could possibly have been reading at that moment. It nourished all of my particular tastes and created new ones that I never knew existed. I realise I'm cheating a little, and that Viraconium is technically 4 books, 3 novels and 1 collection of stories, but in my edition they're all collected in a single volume. From the outset I was captivated by the way that Viraconium blends luscious lyricism and elusive prose with highly inventive science fiction and fantasy world building, which are both qualities I admire tremendously in literature. This one felt somehow written just for me. At a certain point I became particularly impressed by the progression between its books, like the metropolis at the heart of each of these books in the cycle. Viraconium is not one thing at all. Instead, it's a sort of protean entity. Its atmospheres and modes of storytelling shift and warp over time. Viraconium is an object seen at various angles, at myriad orders of magnitude, changeful under the light of an alien moon, flaring up under a dying sun. The first book, The Pastel City, is in the most recognizable traditional fantasy mode, concerned with an aging noble warrior class who lament the changing order, lost loyalties, and cling to an age of heroism in its dying days. It has a melancholic weight, shot through with the grandeur of pre-Raphaelite glamour. In Viraconium, the third novel sees the city cast in the mould of 19th century Paris, whose streets are stalked by vagabonds and decadent poets. Viraconium Nights, the book of stories, often explores the rural outskirts of the city, its folkloric traditions and lost pagan rituals. But it's the second novel, A Storm of Wings, that has remained with me most of all. At times, A Storm of Wings feels like reading a poem, especially when Harrison launches into a description of light or landscape. The prose undergoes a kind of metamorphosis and enters this poetic, elevated register, but retains a kind of earthy darkness at the same time. He's truly an extraordinary stylist.
Fires had now sprung up among the cottages, set by the sailors before they left, and small flames danced behind the panes of the dilapidated conservatory above the town. The strip of black water between the boat and the quay grew wider. The frigid cliffs slipped past. The curious flags and strips of coloured rag flying over the conservatory blazed up one by one. Above everything burned the clouds, like the bloody auroral sunset of some other planet.
Even more specifically, it feels a lot like a modernist poem, or a specific modernist poem. The influence of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is worn quite plainly on the sleeve of this novel, and it manifests itself sometimes through direct quotation or slightly more oblique allusions through characters and events. The sustained presence of the tarot and the tarot reader Mam Etela, who seems to echo Eliot's Madame Sosostris. The figure of Benedict Porcemanley, the ancient and prophetic airboatman whose bloated frame floats spectrally in living death, reminds one of the Sibyl at Cumae hanging in a cage in Eliot's epigraph, whose only wish is to die. Many of its characters speak in a garbled glossolalia, a polyglot collage of dead languages, allusions to fallen cities, shards of ephemera, scraps of popular song. Like Eliot's poem, A Storm of Wings also depicts a world darkened by the long shadow of war. The broader themes of disintegration, the fragmentation of cultural memory, and the horror of rebirth seem to have their roots that clutch in Eliot's broken epic of modernity. If you'd like to read more about the connections between The Wasteland and A Storm of Wings, you could do a lot worse than going to Culture Cat's blog, in which there's a really informative post on that subject. I'll leave a link in the description. And as much as I've focused more specifically on A Storm of Wings, it's really the cumulative impact of all four of these books that had me reeling. I just felt so utterly immersed in this book, and it gave me more pleasure than any other that I read this year, and I sincerely hope that many of you will go and check it out if you're not already fans. Looking back at my reading from 2024, one thing I'm really struck by is quite how Anglophone and even largely English it is. I think there must be something inside me that just needed that at the moment. I haven't been home to my home country for quite a while, for instance, and sometimes I have that longing to get a little bit of a slice of Albion through my fiction. In terms of 2025, I'm hoping at least that I will plug up some gaps in my knowledge of classical antiquity. That's at least my goal. So I've ordered quite a lot of ancient Greek poetry and some books on Homer and on Sappho. And I just lament sometimes that studying classical Greek or Roman literature was never much of a part of my education, and I feel that lack sometimes. So my hope is to remedy that a little bit this year. But I also know that I'm very prone to breaking promises to myself of that sort, and that very likely I'll make a plan and immediately abandon it. So we'll see. Maybe you can hold me to that promise. In any case, thanks so much for watching this video all the way through to the end, and if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel or sharing it with someone online or with a bookish friend. I really appreciate it when you do that. So thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.